Okay, so let's just go back to sort of where we were. I just had to rebuild this quickly. So what we want to do now is render out our shot. So we first have to set up our camera movement and any other animation that's happening. So I'm going to do something really simple. I'm just going to have this thing move in. So I'm going to want to look through both cameras, my perspective and my shot cam. Oops. So I'm just going to position my shot cam to sort of where it's going to be. So let's say I want the shot cam to start here. So I'm going to freeze its transformations. Select my shot cam. Okay, doesn't want to do that. It's fine. Now I want to stay looking at this eye, so actually I could use a shot cam with an aim, but I can probably pretty easily just do this by hand. So I'll just set a key here on frame 1. Oops, I forgot to switch from 24 frames per second to 30. Now I'm just going to do a really short animation just so it doesn't take long to render out. And then let's say over 15 frames, the camera just turns a little bit to give us that feeling of 3D. Nope, we're going too far there. Maybe pushes in a bit. I've got my auto keyframes turned on, so I just get a nice simple camera move like that. Turn off this grid. And then let's say this thing moves in while the camera is moving. Or actually, no, I'm going to have it move in once the camera is settled, so it's easier to make changes to if I need to later on. So let's move this thing off screen. I'm going to freeze its transformations and delete its history. I should call it needle. And so it only has to move in, what's it moving in? Y, I think. No. That's weird. So I'll just set a keyframe here on 15, and then let's say over another 15 frames, or half a second, it'll just move in to my shot. Whoa. And it goes into the eye. Boink. Set a key on that. So, oh, that's kind of weird. So I'm going to get rid of that. Just because I froze the transformations, it put its axis in a weird way. So I'm going to see if I can just adjust these. Okay, so frame 15, set those keys, and frame 30, just move it. Simple, okay? And I would normally go in and make sure like everything is kosher in the graph editor, you know, make sure it's acting the way I want it to. If I want it to slow down before it gets there, I'm not going to worry about that right now. So let's think about what I have to render here. So I need a beauty shot of the eye because it doesn't need anything too special about it because it's got all its details worked into it. But I do want a specular highlight that will play out over the surface of the cornea, and I want a shadow of that needle as it comes forward, right? So let's look at my layers. I already made one here. I'll remake it in a second. But so your master layer, as you know, has everything in it. You never render your master layer Usually you always make a separate layer. This is just where you house all your stuff. Now if you're doing a beauty shot, you can render from the master layer, but we want to make a shadow layer, a specular layer, and maybe do a depth pass too. And we might even want to do ambient occlusion, but I'm not sure, but we'll set one up anyway. Now I should actually put a Mila material on that needle as well, while I'm thinking about it. I'm not going to do anything fancy. You could make it reflective and then render out a reflection pass so it reflects the environment, but let's not do that right now. So here's my new Mila material. I'm just going to make it blue. Why not? Okay. So let's just advance the timeline here a little bit. Oh, I didn't apply it. So just do a little render. Okay, so we got something like this. Good. So let's think how we're going to break things up into render layers. Now, first of all, I want this thing to be on its own render layer. I'm just going to render the needle out by itself. Okay? But a couple of things happen. Now, this thing goes into the eye, right? So since it goes into the eye, I need something to block it. So if it's on its own render layer, and it's in After Effects, it's just going to be sitting on top. So it's got to have the eye in there. So when it goes through, it blocks the part of the needle that goes through. So to do that, we can add what's called a use background shader. Did you guys use that before? Use background? Okay, so this is super handy shader. Use it all the time. So I'm going to select all of these things. And do I need the light? Yeah, I probably need the light, so I'll add the light. So I've got all those things selected, and I'm going to create a new render layer. And I'll call this one needle. Okay. So what do we have to change here? Now the needle should just stay the same. I don't want that light casting shadows in this layer, so I'm going to select that light and open up the attribute editor. And so this is what you're doing in render layers a lot of the time. You're going in and changing render settings. So I've got in the layer where I don't want shadows to be cast, I can right-click on this Use Ray Trace Shadows option and just say Create a Layer Override and turn that off. So every other layer this light's in, it will have shadows turned on, but now it'll be turned off for this layer, which is what I want. It'll still cast light onto that needle. It'll cast light onto the eye, but it won't matter because that's an emissive object because of the Mila shader. Right? Is that good? Is that good? Yes. So now if I were to render this out, we'll just see what we saw before. But now we don't want to see the eye, so we're going to put the Use Background shader on the eye. So let's just create that in the Hypershade first. So you'll find this under the Maya Surface Shaders. It's right down here at the bottom. It's called Use Background. And if we just map this out. So what this is used for in things like, an example you often see for the Use Background shader is if, let's say you've got a painted backdrop of clouds, like a color plate that you've painted, and you've got an animated airplane flying in front of them. And you want it to look like it's casting a shadow onto the 3D object of the clouds. You can make an object that's kind of lumpy and bumpy shaped, that looks sort of like it could be cloud shaped, and then put the Use Background shader on it. And what it'll do is that it will, as the shadow is cast by the airplane, the shadow will show up on that Use Background shader, but nothing else. So it'll be like a moving shadow in empty space. And then when it's put on top of that painting of the clouds, it'll make it look like the clouds work. So you can use it to catch shadows. We're going to use that in a minute. But you can also use it for compositing. So let's say we've got an object like this, and then another object that is in front of it, you're the camera, and then it goes behind it. So if it stayed in front of the object the whole time, you just render it in separate layers, foreground, background. But if it has to go in front and then behind, you need to have a way to render them out separately, but then when it goes behind, it will cut it off. So use background shader, just make something invisible, essentially, but it will block objects that go behind them. So we'll just take these objects here in this layer, the eye and the surrounding tissue, and we'll apply this use background shader. So you can see now it just takes on the color of the background. So if I save this image and render it out, now we'll just see the needle, and it stops where it goes to dead. But you can see there's still something going on here. Because you can also use it to catch reflections. It can be a blank object reflection catcher. There are other ways to do that, though. But for now, we just want to turn that stuff off. So in the use background shader, I'm going to give this a name. So we'll just call this UB blocker. So it can catch reflections and specularity, but we just want to turn all of that stuff off. So when you're just using it as a blocking object, you just turn all the settings to 0 in the use background shader. So now, when I get my render view, I'll just save that image and render it out. So now you just see this. There's no reflection, there's nothing, but where it passes into the eye here, it's just blocked. Okay, so that's going to be our needle layer. What else do we need? We need a shadow layer. So I've already got one, so I'm just going to delete it and create it again. So for me, this is one time where it's easier just to make a layer than trying to make it work in render passes. I'm not sure how it would work in render passes. Since we just want to catch the shadows in this layer, we can just replace all the materials of these objects and use another use background shader. So I'm going to again select all of these objects, and I need the light because I need something to cast the shadow, and create a new layer, and I'll call this one shadow. And I need another use background shader. I'm going to delete the one I created earlier. I'm going to delete the one I created earlier. So I'll create another use background shader. And I'm going to apply it to I'm just going to apply it to the eye and the surrounding tissue. Okay. And I'm going to call it something new, just so we don't get confused. So this would be use background shadow. So now if I were to render this without changing anything, we get the same thing as before. You can barely see it there, but the reflection is there. And if we look in the it didn't apply it that way. We would see a shadow being caught there too. So let me just, I think my normals are reversed. This is my old file. Let me just double check here. Oh no, those are pointing in the right way. Okay. So in this use background shader, the shadow one, we want to turn specular color to 0, we want to turn reflectivity to 0, reflection limit to 0, but shadow mask we want to keep turned on. Let's see if this is going to work. Oh, I'm in the master. Okay. So the use ray trace shadows are on. want to make sure this thing is casting shadows. It is. So any object on any layer, when you want to change the settings of how it renders, it's all in its shape node. So the needle shape is casting shadows. I don't need it to receive shadows, so I can always right-click on that, create layer override, and turn that off. And in this case, actually, I don't even want to be able to see this. I just want it to cast shadows. So in this case, I would turn the primary visibility of this thing off. So it's there in the shot to cast shadows, but it's not going to render as that blue bar. And I don't want the eye or the tissue surrounding it to cast shadows, so I can select each of those. And I can turn off their cast shadows option. Same with the eye itself. I do want them to receive shadows, so I turn that on. And primary visibility has to be turned on, but we have this shader working. Now, it's not working exactly the way I want. It did moments ago, of course. So here what we're seeing, no, that's not working. So what you would normally see here is you should just see a black screen, but then when you look in the alpha channel, it should be leaving just the shadow behind as a white cutout area. So let me just set this up one more time. I'm not sure what I'm seeing here. Primary visibility is turned off. It's casting shadows. Got that light turned on. Let me look through here. Oh no, it is working. So I thought this was just the alpha channel of the thing, but it's actually bent down here. It's the shadow where it goes over part of the tissue. Okay, so that's going to be our shadow pass. We just go back in here. Yep.
Okay, so if you turn off primary visibility on an object,
Yep.
you can't see it, but it'll still affect other objects around it.
Yeah.
And you can still cast shadows or see shadows.
Exactly.
So,
Or appear in reflections or refractions, but it just won't appear as the primary. Its primary visibility won't be there.
but so what's the difference between doing that and using use background shader on it?
Well, you can. I could use the use background shader on it, but in this case, I don't want it to receive shadows or anything. In this case, I just need it to cast shadows. So you could. It would work.
So for the eye, couldn't you just turn off the visibility?
Well,
the other things?
Well, no. If we turn off the primary visibility, then it's got nothing to receive shadows on. You need that material will do. It's called an alpha cutout. So where a shadow falls on it, it will cut out the alpha, and that wouldn't happen just on a normal object. Yeah. So that's why you're using it for that specific purpose. Okay. So we've got the needle, and of course the one thing we haven't set up yet is just the eye, so we can just select these two objects. We don't need the light for this, and I'll just create another layer and call this eye. And then finally, is it final? We want a specular pass. So there are different ways to do this, but let's do this. Sorry, I use sort of pass and layer interchangeably. I just mean rendering out separate images that contain this information. In this case, I would do it probably with a render layer. So to do that, all I really need is the eye and the surrounding tissue and the light. So I'll select those things. Is that everything? Yeah. And I'll create a new layer, and I'll call this one spec. So for this, now this is just kind of an old way of doing it, but it works well. I'm just going to replace these materials with a specular material. And in fact, I don't even really need it on this. Now that I think about it, I don't need it on this thing here. But I do want this to block the eye. So if the specular is creeping over the eye here, we don't want it to appear where it goes underneath the soft tissue, right? So I'm going to put that same use background shader, the blocker, on the soft tissue. So now I just have the eye, and I'm going to put a new, I guess I should put a Mila material, but I don't really have to. I'm just going to put a blend or something on this thing. So I can just right click on it and say assign new material, and I'll do a blend or a fungi. So a fungi can have a nice tight specular. So whatever, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to make it black and give it a bright specular and reduce the highlight size. So something like that. So if I render this now, just get a little dot of light like that. But it's all on black. Yeah.
Technically speaking, so we basically could do this all with the Mila material, right? Because it has all the passes, so you wouldn't have to make layers. You would just make your Mila and just export all of it. Right?
You could, but you run into some problems. So, for example, this Mila material is emissive, right? So it's not going to have shadows cast on it. It won't work. So if you try.
Turn it off,
You could, but I need that emissiveness to make the photo just look like it's a lit object, right?
Yeah.
So you get into this problem where it works for one thing, but it doesn't work for another. So in that case, I would make a render layer. But you're right. If it was just a regular Mila material that had the needle approaching it and had a shadow cast on it, I could just say, okay, render out the shadow separately by clicking that pass.
Yeah.
But then you'd still get into some issues sometimes where, so for example, in that shadow pass, I don't want this object casting shadows onto this object. So you'd still have to go in and turn off some of the render settings for different things. So it just takes a little getting used to. And honestly, there are only a few render layers pass setups that you really need. And so throughout this project, this is what the MRP really does for you. It gives you an idea of what the scope of a project is, what you need to make things happen. Of course, you'll keep learning afterwards, but that's a good question. You can do a lot of this stuff here. So let's go into the eye layer. And okay, let's just leave it like that for now, because the beauty about compositing and doing rendering is that I can go back and add another layer and render that out later. Okay, so save. Yes, good idea. Thanks. Let's make sure everything is good. So there's my needle. Shouldn't be casting a shadow. So generally you do a little test render for each one. So that rendered from the wrong view. Options, tests, render using... Okay, that's good. And if I check my alpha, good. Shadow pass, do a quick check here. Good. I should just be that. And there's no alpha here because it's filling the whole screen, right? So we just get white. And then spec we just checked, so I assume it's good. Command save. Now, let's set up. So now I'm not doing any render passes right now. I'm just going to do render layers. I might come back and do an ambient occlusion after, but let's just get this going. So I'm going to open up the render settings here. And under quality, I'm just going to leave it at 0.25. Doesn't really matter. For your full rendering, you have to test. Sometimes if you go all the way up to 1, it takes too long to render. So the question is, what's good enough? It's what looks good enough. So you have to decide yourself. You'll see some things need higher quality if you're doing subsurface scattering, where light goes through an object and it has to sample what the light would look like inside. Sometimes you have to bump that way up, otherwise it gets grainy and crawly. Like it looks like those little dots are moving around. So you've got to play with this. Also glossiness. So if you have something that's a reflective object and then you add some roughness to it so it breaks up the specular, you often have to turn this up to get good quality, things like that. A couple of things that sometimes I'll change. The Gaussian filter. So whenever you see the word filter, it means blur, how it's blurring from one pixel to the next, sampling the colors of the pixels around it. Gaussian makes a bit of a slightly soft image. Sometimes I'll switch to Mitchell, and don't ask me what these things mean. It's math stuff. But Mitchell will tend to give you a slightly sharper image, so it kind of depends what you want it to look like. There are other things to consider here in the render settings. This is still under quality, but if you're not doing any reflections, turn this down, right? If you don't, because when it says trace depth, that means how many times is it going to trace a point of light. So a light, well, actually it works this way, that a camera casts out samples, little points that go into space. It traces their path, and then it bounces them off an object back to the light source. So it kind of works in reverse. But when it says trace depth reflection 4, if you have two mirrors in front of each other, it will check 1, 2, 3, 4 before going back to the light. So you could have double reflections. And that's stuff you just don't need. So you can just turn that down to 1 if you've got just a normal reflection. Transmission, same thing. If a light has to go through an object, if it's a transparent object or something, you have to make sure you have the number high enough so it can go through enough surfaces to get out the other side. But if it doesn't have to do that, you can turn that down. And max trace depth is similar, just how many surfaces it will go through. This is an overall volume. So this has happened to me before, where you're setting up something and you forget that there's a reflection, or just a very subtle reflection on something, and you have two objects close together. I was just doing this for endothelial cells or something, and I had them slightly reflective, and I didn't turn this down. So every time I was rendering, it was going 1, 2, 3, 4, checking, and the render time went through the roof. So it wasn't worth it. So that kind of stuff. So lighting quality is set to 1. Okay, great, whatever. So now we're not going to do any passes right now. We're just going to rely on what we've got here. Under the common settings. So we're rendering more than one frame, so you need a number. So name, number, extension. Frame padding, you've seen this before, it's a number of zeros before the first number. And then the start and end frame, so I'm going from 1 to 30. Now, the naming convention, this is important. So, did I name this? So I would usually name it something like this. I'd right-click in the file name prefix, and I would use the scene name, because in your project your scene name will be the sequence and shot that you're in, right? Underscore render layer. So I'm right-clicking, getting those options. And so we would get something for each called CamProj 2016 underscore spec, and then one for underscore I, shadow, needle, and so on. But I also want to have a unique folder for each of these things. So I can just copy this, put a slash, and paste it. So we'll first create a folder with that name, and then we'll name each file like that. So I'm just checking up here to see if it's working. So it's going users, mark, Dropbox, blah, blah, lecture 3, action, projection. Now it should be going to the renders folder. Yep, so it's going to the renders folder, CamProj, blah, blah folder. It's from there to there. Yep, good. Fantastic. Now what else should I check? Camera. Make sure I've got the right camera chosen. Do I? No, of course not. Now in this case, you want to make sure you don't select the Proj Cam by accident. So if you want to, you can select cameras that you're not using for rendering and turn off their renderability. So there's my proj cam. I can open up its attribute editor and find under the output settings, oh, it's already renderable, it's turned off for that one. You can do it for your perspective camera too. Did Stuart talk to you about doing command line renders? Like not doing it through Maya, but through the terminal window where you type in weird commands with dashes and things like that. Okay, well, we're not going to do that right now, but going forward, when you're doing your actual renders, if you're doing them on these individual machines, if you're doing it on the render farm, it's different. But a lot of the time, I won't even launch Maya. You just do it through commands in the command line, and it will start your renders without loading Maya. So it saves some system resources, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, close, save. Now go to render and batch render. Now everything should be good. So you guys all have, how many? I think you've got 12 cores on these machines, or no, maybe 8 cores. I've got 8 cores here, but you've got 2 chips with 4 or 6 cores each. I can't remember. But so the render thread should reflect that. I've got that should work for mine. So batch render and close. And now if we open the script editor, we should see it work. So you can see that it's doing the needle layer first. This will take longer than I had hoped, but you can see it does one layer at a time rather than the first frame from each layer. So we can go in and just double check that it was created. Okay, so what's something I could have done to make this more efficient? Yeah?
Don't render when the camera is still.
Yep, I definitely could do that. My camera, I can't remember how it works, but the needle doesn't show up, I think, until frame 15, right? So there's no point in rendering at these 15 blank frames. So the other thing you should think about, I'm pretending like I did this on purpose, but I just totally forgot. But the other thing to do is to go in here and change the frame numbers for each one. So for this one, instead of starting on frame 1, I can right-click on there and go to Create Layer Override and just type 15. So then it will just ignore those first 15 frames and start from there. The only thing that makes it a little trickier is that when you have to line things up in After Effects, everything's not the same length anymore. So you just have to shift stuff over and make sure it starts at the right spot. Otherwise, the shadow will be moving 1 frame ahead of the needle and all that kind of stuff. But you're right. So if you don't have a moving camera at all, and let's say I didn't have a moving camera, and I'm just looking at the eye, and the eye never changes. So I just have to render a single frame of the eye. Then I have to render 15 frames of the needle, 15 frames of the shadow, because we only see that in the last 15 frames. We only really need, well, we don't need any change in the specular if it's not moving, but even with the specular, it only moves when the camera moves. So we just have to render the 15 frames and then just stretch out the first frame to cover the whole composition. So really, I'm rendering double what I need to for every frame, for every layer here, except for the eye. Or even the eye I'm doing double because it stops moving halfway through. So it's doing the eye now. So once the eye is done, we'll go into After Effects, and we'll bring that in. So I'm still using on this machine After Effects CS6. So you've got the CC version, but we're not doing anything fancy. So I'm just going to,
So I don't know if I missed it, but how would
Yeah. So it's doing all the layers right now. So if we look here in the render layers tab, let me just, okay, rip it off. These ones are all depressed, so it means it's doing every layer. So if I didn't want to do a layer, you can just turn that off. Like if I had to redo just one layer, just turn that off. Good question. Sorry, I'm going to make certain assumptions. You have to. It's one of the tricky things is when you teach class over and over again, you kind of forget who you guys are. Did I tell them that, or was that last year? So if there's anything like that, please just ask me. Okay, so back into After Effects. So I'm just going to import the eye layer, dog glow. Where am I? Dropbox. MSC 2017, mapping, projection mapping, renders, eye. Okay. Well, that doesn't look promising. Oh, it's OpenEXR. It should just record it though. That should not work at all. Okay, that worked. Shadow, specular. No, it's still rendering them. Okay, so that didn't work, so let's go in and fix that. I don't know why that didn't work, but it didn't. So did shadow, although I don't see it in there. So let's just go back in here and redo eye. And delete those. So if we look here, just going to check the render again just to make sure. Okay. Now one thing, I just want to make sure it's set to use the mental ray renderer. Now it should be because we had all the mental ray settings. Yeah. I'm going to change the output file format. Instead of OpenEXR, let's do a TIFF for this one. And then the eye only has to move from frame 1 to frame 15. So I will open up the render settings for eye and do a create layer override for end frame and change that to 15. And now I just want to re-render that one out, so I'll turn the other ones off and I'll do another quick batch render. Okay, so let's finish the first one so we can take a look at it. That's better. But it's not respecting the linear light of the thing, but that's fine. We can just work with this for now. Okay, so I'll go back into After Effects and I'll just reload the footage and it should recognize the new stuff. Go back here. It doesn't recognize it because I changed the name to have a TIFF, so just open that. So you can see that it's convincing enough, you know, for a quick shot. And we'll bring in the other stuff. Bring in the needle. So the needle doesn't show up until here. So we get to the end of the eye and we need it to sit at that frame, right? We've got 15 of them now. So the way to do that is to enable time remapping. You guys did that before? So this is something I use all the time when I'm working on projects. So with the layer selected, just go to Time, Enable Time Remapping. And it just puts a keyframe at the beginning, at the end, and then you can use that to hold on the last frame. You can use it for lots of other things too, but in particular, you can use it to just freeze on a frame. Okay, so far so good. Now in some ways this doesn't look convincing because this looks like it's in a different world. Like it doesn't seem to be reflected. So it would probably be better to do a reflection pass on the eye that shows the reflection of the needle as it approaches too. That would help sell it a little bit. We can always do that later, but I'll bring in the shadow layer, see if that worked. So bring this on here. Okay, so that worked. Now it's got to be under the needle, of course, and on top of the eye. Now it's pure black, like that, which doesn't work in that world either. So, and you could also get a better result with an area light. So what an area light would do, it would make the shadow sharper near the casting object, and it would get softer as you go away. So that would work better too. But for now, I can just reduce the transparency a bit. I can blur the whole thing slightly, just using, I don't know, a Gaussian blur or something. Just so it's kind of subtle, it's there, but not. It just makes it look like it's in the world a little bit more. Right? And then the specular, so let's put that in. Let's see if this works. Oh, it didn't even render. Well, okay. So the specular we just need from 1 to 15 as well. Let's try that. I'm going to render that as a TIFF too. Now this should render quickly. So if we go back into After Effects, the other benefit of having things on separate layers is you can adjust their colors separately and things like that, as you know. So if I want the needle to be a different color, I can just go color correction, hue, saturation, and colorize it. Change it to a different color. Same with the eye. If it looks like the exposure is too dark here, I can go in and exposure is under channels, no, color correction. I can tweak that. Change the way I want it to look. Like terrible. So I can just change the gamma. So you can see what. Like that. Now I can go in and try and bring in that specular. Should work. So here it's asking me what I want to do with the alpha, and you've seen this before, right? So it should be pre-multiplied against black, and that's how it's going to handle the edges of the objects against the infinite blackness of space. In this case, it doesn't really matter, but most of the time you should be rendering against black. So now that I've got it here, I can bring it in. And so we've got this. Now we just want to change the blend mode to add. We'll get rid of the black part for us. And so now we've got that little specular moving over the surface, which helps just make it look a little more like a 3D object. And you can see it's broken up a little bit. It's actually an artifact of the fact that it's near the polar end, so those little sharp polygons. But in this case, it kind of works. So I have to time remap it. And just stretch it out. Now it should be underneath the needle, of course. And under the shadow? Yeah, probably under the shadow. Shadow probably won't affect it. And we get something like that. Now, of course, if I wanted to change some of these things, I could add some color to that, or I can blur that thing slightly. Gaussian blur is a good all-around blur. It does 8 samples in 8 different directions. Things like the fast blur will only do 4 samples, but there you go. Bob's your uncle. So the last thing I'm going to do before we stop for break, and then you guys can work on this in the afternoon. And the other thing we can do this afternoon, I can come around and talk about your shots if you have questions about what you're doing for shots. But let's say I wanted to do a depth pass here. I'll set that up. Now, you could do a depth pass on the actual objects that have Mila materials, and maybe that's the best thing to do. But you can also set up just a dummy layer that just has black materials on it and just turn depth on. But for now, I'll just use the actual objects, just because it can render faster when there's no textures or anything to consider. So I'll create a new layer. I'll call this one depth. Turn off the renderability of that one. And here I'm going to open up the render passes. Is this going to work? It'll probably work. So here under render passes, under the scene tab, down towards the bottom, you can turn on depth. Now let's try. Okay, so rendered out. Now if you go under File, in the render view, it should give you the option to load render pass. It doesn't always work. Yep, see, it didn't work here, but it should render it when we do a batch render. I'm going to try and set up another layer. I'm just going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to create a new Mila material that's just pure black. Okay, and I'll just call this black Mila. And I will apply it to all of these objects. And in this render, so depth is turned on here too. Oh no, I'm back here. Yeah, depth is turned on here. Yeah. So, I remember now. One of the problems with the render passes is that when you turn on depth for one layer, it turns it on for every layer. And if you try and right-click over these names, normally you would get a Create Layer Override option. You don't get it here. This is one of the things they don't document. But there is a way to turn it off in other layers. So, it's just a little tricky. Any of these render pass options that you want to turn off in other layers, you can do this way. So, everything in Maya, when you create something, it creates a new node. And it's connected through its attributes to other things to make a network of nodes. So there's actually going to be a depth node somewhere. So if we open up the outliner, and you can see there's no depth node here, but the way to see all the hidden stuff in Maya is to, under the outliner, under display, go to where it says DAG objects only. That means dependency something graph objects only. Those are the ones that you can see and interact with normally. But if you turn that off, it shows you all the junk that's going on here. It shows you your animation curves, shows you all this other stuff about your layers, and you'll find somewhere in here one called depth pass. If you don't see it, you can just type up here DEP depth, and then you'll see it. Oh, that's a different one. Depth pass. If I double click on that, it'll open the node in the attribute editor. So if I'm on a layer where I don't want that depth to be calculated, I can right click on where it says renderable, create layer override, and turn it off for that layer. So this is one of the things, the Mila material system is implemented, but there are some things they still have to tidy up, and this is one of them. You should be able to turn this off inside this layer here. So for now, when I go back up here, you can see it's turned on. So, and for this one too. So I just want to see what this looks like. So does the render pass? No, it's not going to show me. For some reason, sometimes it won't preview it for you. Oh, it might be because I have TIFF turned on. So if I turn on OpenEXR, let's try this again. Nope, still doesn't want to, but it should render it out ultimately. So now the question is, why do I just put a black shader on here? Sorry about the whistle. Black shader. Because I've already rendered out all the other color components to this. And so if that's the case and I need to add an extra depth pass, I don't need to spend time calculating that stuff again. So I'll just turn that stuff off. In fact, I'll just delete this one. I'm going to render this one out and see if it works. I don't know if it's going to. I hope so. Batch render. Let's see. It should render quickly. Okay. So let me just grab that, at least that first one, so we can see. Oh, I didn't really need to do the whole thing, but. Okay, so now bring it in here. So you guys worked with OpenEXRs before, right? Where you have to use the extractor to take that stuff out. Okay, so you can remind me when I go wrong here. So effect, 3D channel, extractor. Oh yeah, now I remember. Okay. Yeah, so that it's showing a depth channel, so I just have to put it into all the channels and then leave alpha as copy. Then we have to change the white and black points, right? Did you do depth when you did this before? I can't remember what the values are. Something like 35. Yeah, 35 and 31. Why are they those numbers? I have no idea. 4 is. So you can see I'm getting some depth information here. Could be better. And it's actually inverted. It's acting a little weird, to be honest. There we go. So we can use this to apply the camera depth or something like that, but we'll do that afterwards. You can also, for something like this, you can just do a really fakey fake depth with something like over the. So I'm not using the depth pass for this, but underneath the shadow layer, I can create a new adjustment layer. So adjustment layer is going to just apply some setting to everything below it. So I'll just use a fast blur. And then if I just put a mask around that, so I can just keep it to the outside. And then blur that mask a bit, the edge of the mask. So I'm going to feather the mask edge, I don't know, 50 pixels. And then turn that blur down a bit. So you can cheat it a little bit too, rather than, and sometimes when you have to make a quick correction to something, sometimes you can get away with doing something like this, where it's a little blurred on the outside, kind of hides some of the faults here. And that can still come in. You could even blur the edge of this out a little bit. So, yeah.
Did the depth do anything?
It did, but so we got this, and so what we could do with the depth pass instead, there are a number of ways you can use the depth pass, but one way we could use it is with this adjustment layer. So let me get rid of that mask. So I have to change the settings on this depth layer. I have to experiment to figure out where the black and white point should be. So we get the white coming out towards us and the black going away from us. It's doing something kind of weird. I don't know. It needs to be -10. Oh, that's better. So I'm just trying to push it in so we get the black points, the things that are closest to us. I think with this map, it's really banding here, but the cornea and the brow and underneath are about at the same level, and these parts where it recedes are going back. But I'm just trying to boost the contrast here a little bit. It's the tricky part. These OpenEXR is extracting. I'm going to just try something like that. So one way we can use this is to take an adjustment layer with, I'll just do a lot of blur on it, and we can use a track matte. So you guys used track mattes before? So we can say, look at the layer above me, use its luma values to apply this effect below, or a luma inverted value. So in this case, my depth isn't working that well, but if this was pure white in the depth mask here, it would be unblurred, and it would be blurred here, or we want to blur the outside. But in this case, because they are, this top part, the cornea, and the bottom part are all at the same sort of distance from the camera, it's not going to work that well. So that's why I was thinking we could fake it with that, just that mask. So actually, when I do this kind of stuff, I use so you can see it doing some stuff there. I use a program or a plugin called Frischluft, which we don't have, sadly. But when you're out working in the world, it's worth the $100 investment for sure, or $200. It's paid for itself many times over. So there is. Anyway, what I'll try and do is I'll try and get a depth pass working better for something else, and I can show you. But this one's not a great example of that. So we can just use the adjustment layer with a mask to apply a blur around it. And just in the last 3 minutes, that we have before we break for lunch, just let me show you how to do an ambient occlusion pass. So if I take, I'm just going to duplicate this eye layer, and I'm going to call this AO. I'm going to duplicate that. Oops. I'm going to duplicate that layer. And I'll call this AO RL for render layer. So there are two ways to set this up. Oops, I'm missing something. So in this one, we can just look at the Mila settings. And we can go to Scene, and down at the bottom, we can turn on ambient occlusion. Now it's throwing an error. I'm not sure why. But it should work that when we so you can see it's taking longer to render here. It's actually much longer. So it's calculating the distance between objects and figuring out where it should shadow. It's not going to show up in the beauty pass. It shows up as an entirely separate render pass. It's not going to show up here. But you can see that it took quite a while to render. So another way of doing it is to take those same objects and again, you can put on any type of material. I'm just going to put a black surface shader on these because I don't want it to react to light or anything like that. So I'll just create a surface shader here. So we're not using the Mila stuff for this one, so it doesn't need to be a Mila material. Actually, I don't even need to do that. It's going to do it for me automatically. But this is an old way of doing it in Maya, and they kept it in here, so you can actually still use it. But if you right-click on a render layer and go down to Attributes, it will open up the attribute editor for that actual render layer. Oops. Do that again. So it looks like this, but there's some presets built in here. If you click on that, you can go to Occlusion. And it actually adds that surface shader for you, so you actually didn't have to do that, I forgot. And now if I just render this straight out, it will render. Now an ambient occlusion pass always takes a fair amount of time, so you just want to use it when you need it. In this case, we don't really need it because the photograph has all this information in it already. So we'll render out something like this. And then you can put that in your scene and just multiply it over to get that self-shadowing crevices and things like that. You can see this is an ugly map. It's so grainy and it's maybe traveling too far up. So if you want to do something like this, and this is how I still actually do most of my ambient occlusion stuff rather than the Mila way. But if I go into the out color here of the surface shader that's applied to all these objects, there's this MIB ambient occlusion shader that's been attached. And if you want it to be a better quality, you can turn up the samples, and you want to do it in binary, so it's 16, you can do 64 instead, for better quality. The other thing to change is the max distance. So this is how much it will sample in the scene. So for our scene, it only really needs to sample 1 or 2 units. It doesn't need to sample from this part of the soft tissue to the back of the eye because it doesn't matter. So, but it's doing all of that if you just leave it at its default. So instead, I can change it to maybe 2 for the max distance here. And then I can render that again. So let's just save the first one. And so that took 24 seconds. And if I render it again, now I increased the quality, so the samples are up to 64, but I reduced the fall-off distance. So you can see already it's giving us a much cleaner render. This is actually a nice way if you want to do, this would be good for doing your statue. If you wanted to make it look almost like a carbon dust, you can combine just pure ambient occlusion with an interesting specular. And so it can be like a moving shaded drawing. I've used that before, and it can look good. So this took 10 seconds longer because our samples were higher, but we got a much better quality image.
Get to the attribute.
Yep, so it just opened up by default when you do that, but if you go into the hypershade, whoa, now there's going to be a new surface shader that was created when you do that preset. And if you just map that out, there's the surface shader here, and they don't name it anything sensible, but it attaches an MIB, ambient occlusion. And you can just open that in the attribute editor.
You just double click on that.
Or Control A. Yeah, for attribute. Okay. Yeah.
And then once that gets imported into After Effects, do you put like the Luma on it?
No, so for that, you put it on top of everything except speculars, probably. You put it under speculars and you set it to multiply. And then usually it's going to be too dark, so multiply gets rid of whites and leaves anything black and not white, and it will multiply the values below it. So black equals 0. So if you have a pure black in that ambient occlusion, like right in the caruncle here, or in the canthus, then it will make all the colors underneath it black. Usually you don't want it to go pure black, so you turn down the transparency a bit. For this one, I wouldn't bother doing it because it is in the photo already, that kind of self-shadowing. But it is it adds a real spark of realism to something. I can't, let me see if I... I'll find an example of it later. I don't think I have it here on this machine. But yeah, so ambient occlusion is one thing I almost always render, but I plan for it because it takes a long time. Because it adds real definition to things that other types of shadowing doesn't. In fact, I usually don't use shadows unless I need to show the relationship between one moving object and another thing. But I'll use ambient occlusion just to add sort of concreteness and emphasis to my models. Yeah. So this afternoon, I just want you guys to work on doing something like this, setting this up, going through the steps of rendering out the different things you need and putting them back together in After Effects. And then you can just render out from After Effects. You guys know how to do that. Okay, any questions? I'm sorry the first part didn't record, but...